So I'm Chris McHugh Potts. I'm a nearly 30-year resident of Medfield with 3 grown children. The youngest is a sophomore in college. I am so excited to have Peter Gray here tonight. I'm probably one of his biggest fans, and just love his philosophy and care deeply about all the things that he advocates for with regard to what's good for children. He is a researcher and a professor of psychology. He was at Boston College for 30 years, now retired, but still researching. He's the author of Free to Learn: Why Unleashing the Instinct to Play Will Make Our Children Happier, More Self-Reliant, and Better Students for Life. He's a frequent writer and blogger. Psychology Today is one of the places I always tend to see him on a range of topics related to childhood play and its educational value, as well as freedom, resiliency, and other issues. His newest initiative is Let Grow, which focuses on promoting childhood independence and resiliency I loved this line, with the mission to press the reset button on a culture bent on overestimating danger and underestimating kids. So with that, Peter, go ahead.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And it's nice I'm not actually seeing all of you. The screen isn't showing everybody here, but it's nice to know that you're here. You're all neighbors of mine. I live in Millis, not too far away from you. So I'm going to talk about something that is really a national crisis, or actually even an international crisis. I wrote an article a few years ago, an academic article, entitled "The Decline of Play and the Rise of Mental Disorders in Children and Adolescents." And I'm going to start by talking about what I wrote there, that based on not so much my research as other people's research, which I brought together. As I talk about this, I'm going to use the word play, but what I really mean by play is freedom. What I really mean by play is the things that children choose to do on their own, that they direct, that they are doing because they want to do it. They're not doing it because anybody is telling them to do it, or because anybody's rewarding them to do it or punishing them for not doing it. So in a sense, play is pretty close to synonymous with freedom in the way that at least I'm using it now. I have to confess that sometimes I use the word play to have different meanings for different purposes. Play is like a lot of words that can have a number of different meanings, but here I really mean children's self-chosen, self-directed activities. So over the past 60 years, basically the period of my adult life, there has been a huge decline in children's opportunities to play freely, to play and explore, to do things independently of adults. This has been well documented by social scientists. The historian Howard Chudikoff wrote about it in a book on the history of children and play in America. He described the first half of the 20th century as the golden age of children's play, because by the beginning of the 20th century, we had more or less done away with child labor, or at least intense child labor. So children were free in ways that they hadn't been before. We had school then, compulsory schooling, but it wasn't the big deal that it has become more recently. It occupied less time, it was less onerous. And so children had, during that first half of the 20th century, children had a lot of time to play and explore. According to Chudikoff, and this fits kind of with my own personal observations over the course of my life, was sort of somewhere between the middle of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s that adults began to take that freedom away from children, gradually at first. So over the period of time, over the time between about 1960 and today, there's been a gradual but overall huge decline in children's freedom to just go outdoors and play and do the things that in the past children always did. This has been documented in a number of ways, not just the historical ways, looking at historical records and letters and comments and so on that historians use, but social scientists, for example, have done studies where they'll ask parents, so when you were between 6 and 10 years old, roughly how much time did you have to play outdoors by yourself or with your friends without adults watching you, overseeing what you're doing? And then they'll ask them, so your own child who's between 6 and 10 years old, how much time does your child have? And just over one generation, the difference is very large in those studies. There are also studies where researchers have asked parents to keep a diary of their children's activities over the course of a week, and then they've analyzed it to see how much time the children are playing independently. And there's one group of researchers that did the same study in the same way, about 15 years apart, the two studies, and the difference between the second study and the first study was quite dramatic. The children in the second study were playing much less. They were spending much more time in school, more time doing homework, more time in adult-directed activities, which, by the way, I don't consider to be play. Play is child-directed. It's how children learn to direct their own activities, to take charge of their own lives. So by quite a number of measures, but I have seen this, as I've said, in my own lifetime. So when I was a kid in the 1950s, by the time I was 5 years old, I could go anywhere in town. Admittedly, this was a small town, but my late first wife lived in a very crowded working class neighborhood with busy streets in Brooklyn, New York. And she said that although she couldn't go anywhere all over Brooklyn, she could go outdoors and she could play, and she could play with her friends at the age of 5 or 6. People trusted her. She knew how to deal with traffic. They taught her how to do that, and so on and so forth. That part of New York wasn't any safer than it is now. So that's the kind of change that's occurred. You could go outdoors in the 1950s and into the early 1960s, essentially any time in almost any neighborhood that school wasn't in session or it wasn't dark, and you would find kids outdoors playing, no adults around. Now, if you go out in almost any neighborhood in the United States, and this is true in many other countries as well, if you see children out at all, they're being guarded and directed by adults. If you see children on a playground, there's a pretty good chance they're in some kind of uniforms, following what a coach is telling them to do. We have taken children's freedom to figure out, freedom and responsibility perhaps, to figure out what they want to do, to learn how to solve their own problems, to create their own activities, to negotiate with their peers, and so on and so forth. We've largely taken that away from children, and we do it all for them. So that's the change that's occurred. I think there are a number of reasons for the change. I won't belabor them, but one of them is that there's been a spread of societal fears. We have come for a variety of reasons to believe that it's terribly dangerous out there for our children. People believe that everywhere, even in the safest kinds of places. I mean, I've been back to villages that I lived in. They're just as sleepy and quiet villages as they ever were. Actually more sleepy and quiet because there's not the sound of laughter of kids out there playing anymore. I see in those places, I see kids waiting at the bus stop where we always walk to school or bicycle to school. I see them waiting at the bus stop and their parents standing next to them as if somebody's going to come and snatch the kid away. We've developed this culture of fear, and it is very, really, truly irrational. The kinds of things that we're so afraid of happen Of course they happen. Lightning strikes too, but but they happen so rarely that if we governed our lives and we try to govern our own children's lives on these basis that something terrible could happen that is so unlikely that, there's 1 in a million chances of it happening, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, but then you'd realize it's really very dangerous to stay in bed. So you would just be paralyzed when we operate that way. And we're kind of paralyzing our children nationwide. I don't want to say everybody is, but we kind of are. We've developed a culture of fear regarding children. The other thing that's happened is that school and school-like activities have taken over children's lives. So school is a much bigger deal now than it was when I was a kid, and it's gradually become a much bigger deal. So just for example, when I was in elementary school in the 1950s, first of all, and I've actually looked up the data on this, the school year was 5 weeks shorter than it is now. We've taken a whole month away from summer vacation plus another week during the school year. The school day was on average shorter. But most significantly, the school day in elementary school ended when school ended. Kids did not take homework home. I think New York City was the first city to have homework in elementary school, but we never heard of homework. I mean, once in a while, maybe a teacher would ask us to write a poem at home or a story and bring it in, something creative like that. We never carried books and worksheets back and forth to home. Never was this issue that parents had to sign homework sheets. When you were home, you were home. And you could be part of the family. You could, by the time you were 10 or 11 years old, you might have a paper route or some kind of, might be mowing lawns or shoveling people's sidewalk, which was a kind of independence in itself. It gave you some money, but you had lots of time to play and you were largely playing outdoors with other kids. So, but over the years, by the time my own son was a kid around 8, 9, 10 years old, things had changed a little bit, but not a lot. I mean, he could still ride his bicycle. He started going to the Sudbury Valley School, which Jeff Hyman could tell you about. He was a former student there, which I did a study of it many years ago. But the Sudbury Valley School was a couple of miles away from where we lived, and at 9 years old, when he started, he'd ride his bicycle there, no big deal. Sometimes he'd walk, we didn't drive him there. So there was this understanding, this was around the year, around the late 1970s, early 1980s, that this was true. Later on in the 1980s was when things really began to change regarding this. The fears increased. People began to feel like it was irresponsible to allow a child to travel alone or to do things independently, even though there was no real data indicating that it was becoming any more dangerous than it ever had been before. So those are some of the things that have led to the change. We've also we've become obsessed with the idea that our kids need to not only get into college, but get into the most elite college, even though the research shows that there's no big advantage in going to an elite college, truly. You look at people talk about the correlations. Yeah, I mean, graduates of Harvard make more money than graduates of, let's say, Framingham State College. But, they come from money more often than the people at Framingham State College. And if you come from money, you're likely to be making money when you're 40 years old. If you control for that and you control for other factors, and this kind of research has been done, it doesn't matter what college you go to, even on the most conventional measures, like how much money you're making at age 40, let alone on how happy you are. There's no evidence that you're happier in life for having gone to an elite college than another college, not even correlational evidence for that. So we've become obsessed with things that are kind of irrational, and we've put a lot of pressure on kids, and we've made that schoolwork so important. It's the measure of the person person, those stupid test scores. And so that's part of what we've done to childhood over the years. Now, what are the consequences of that? So over this same roughly 60-year period that children's freedom has been declining, the rates of mental disorders in childhood have been increasing. Gradually, just like the change in children's freedom, decline in children's freedom decline, the rate of increase in mental disorders in childhood has also been gradual, but overall huge. Just like the decline in freedom was gradual, but overall huge. So let me give you some of the data that supports this. So the data is most clear for measures of depression and anxiety. It's not the rates of depression and anxiety among school-age children are enormously greater than they were in the past. And it is not just that we are identifying depression and anxiety differently than we did in the past. It's not that we're seeing it where we didn't see it before, but it still existed before. The data the best data come from standardized clinical questionnaires that have been given over the centuries, really, to normative groups of primarily high school age and middle school age kids that assess depression and anxiety. So for example, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory has a scale in it for assessing depression. And if you look at that scale, this has been the same scale, has been used the same way from the mid-1940s on until the end of the 20th century. I actually don't know of studies using it within the 21st century, but based on that scale, by the end of the 20th century, the rate of what today would be diagnosed as major depressive disorder among teenagers in school is somewhere, depending on exactly how you count and whose data you look at, somewhere between 5 and 8 times what it was in the 1950s. Similarly, there's another test, a standardized test for anxiety. Based on that, looking at what the cutoff would be for diagnosis, suspected generalized anxiety disorder would be the term used today. The rate is again something like 7 or 8 times what it was in the 1950s. That's all up to the year about 2000. Now the data measures since then have been somewhat different, but we have other data indicating that between 2000 and now, these rates have continued to increase. They leveled off for a little while, but they have now been increasing again over the last 10 or 15 years. And if you take that into account, the rates of anxiety, serious clinically significant anxiety and depression among school-age children is probably about 10 times what it was in the 1950s. Absolutely huge increase. We've come almost to think that it's normal for young people to be depressed and anxious. It's not. It was very rare in the past. Common now. It's common now, not because the biology of children has changed. It's common now because we've changed in how we treat children. And my belief is that that change is that we have not allowed children to be children. We've not allowed them to have the freedom that they need to grow, that freedom that they need to develop a sense of confidence that they can solve problems, the freedom that they need to feel that that life is joyful. You know, I mean, you take away play from children and it's kind of a no-brainer that you would get depression. So that's there's another test that I think is very telling that has been given to normative groups of teenagers in school from beginning in the 1960s when this test was first developed. This is the adult version of it is called Rotter's internal external locus of control scale. But there's a version of this for children, school-age children. And what this measures is the degree to which you feel like you are in control of your own life. The degree to which you feel you can solve your own problems, you can choose your own destiny, you can create your own world. Of course, none of us are fully in charge of our own destiny. Things happen that we can't control. But the other end of the scale is the belief that you are the victim of fate and circumstance and powerful other people, and you really have very little control over what happens to you or how to deal with what happens to you. So internal locus of control means I control my fate, I control my life. External locus of control means other people, other things, luck, circumstance, fate controls my life. Now, it turns out that internal locus of control by this test, which again has been given to normative groups over the decades, that the sense of an internal locus of control has continued to decline throughout ever since that test was given in the 1960s. With every generation of kids, they have less of a sense of I control my life. No surprise, right? You know, if we don't let them control their lives at all, how are they ever going to acquire an internal locus of control? If we are raising them in the conditions where we're always in control, we're always protecting them, we're always solving their problems for them, how are they going to learn that, hey, I can solve my own problems? I can figure things out. I could get lost and find my way home. This was a common experience among kids at one time in our history. It's hard to do it today, even without a parent. If you've got an iPhone in your pocket, I've discovered that. But these kinds of things, learning how to deal with bullies, learning how to deal with the bumps in the road of life. This is what childhood is all about, but we're not allowing children to do that. You know, we're not allowing them because we're afraid that that bump will hurt them. Yeah, it will hurt them somewhat. But it also gives them enormous joy to have that freedom, and it gives them enormous confidence when they experience that bump and they realize I can deal with that. I can handle that. So that's so also now here's another reason why anxiety and depression would increase. One thing that clinical psychologists have long known is that if you don't have an internal locus of control, if you believe that you can't solve problems that arise in your life, that sets you up for depression and anxiety. No surprise. I mean, if anything could happen at any time and there's nothing you can do about, that's a pretty depressing view of life. And it's also a pretty anxiety provoking view of life. So that's what, and I think it's really essentially obvious why depriving children of the freedom to do things themselves would create these kinds of changes in children. Now, one of the consequences of this that we're seeing in young adults, people are seeing this on college campuses, employers are seeing it among their young employees, is that we're producing young adults who haven't figured out how to take control of their lives, how to deal with failure, how to deal with the ups and downs of life, and who also want people to tell them, want their bosses, want their professors to tell them exactly what they're supposed to do. Because it's scary to think that I could figure out what to do myself, and I might fail, I might do badly. You better tell me exactly what to do. I'm hearing more and more from employers who are saying, I hire people to figure out how to do the work, but then they ask me how to do the work, and they're supposed to figure that out. But we're raising people not to figure things out. I mean, even school assignments themselves have become more and less creative, less and less like write your own essay on some topic that you're really interested in, and more on how to get the right answer on the multiple choice tests and the standardized exams, So it's no surprise. And the same thing is happening in colleges. And a few years ago, as was said in the introduction, I taught for many years at Boston College, and I'm still in some ways associated with Boston College. And a few years ago, the head of counseling at Boston College invited me to take part in a meeting that he was holding with faculty and with counselors at Boston College. And he pointed out that in the 5 years that he had been the head of the mental health service at Boston College, the rate of use of that service had doubled. And he believed it probably doubled in the 5 years before that. It was becoming overwhelming. They couldn't handle it all. More and more students were coming because of mental health breakdowns. And the breakdowns were very commonly over issues that are routine issues that would happen to anybody in college, almost anybody in college. So you get a bad grade. All right, it's like people are having breakdowns over getting a bad, for some people, a B is a trauma. I'm supposed to only get A's. You've had an argument with your roommate, or you've had a romantic breakup. A romantic breakup is hard for anybody at any age. Of course it is, but you deal with it. And if you've been a kid, growing up with friends and parents who aren't protecting you from the turmoil of friendships and friendships breaking up, you've gone through this before. Your best friend yesterday hates you today, and then you deal with that in some way or another. You get used to it in these kind of more minor ways, and then you're kind of prepared to deal with that big romantic breakup that breaks your heart, but you find that, hey, my heart didn't actually break after all, I can handle it. So that's but this is happening, and it is undermining the academic mission of the universities. Now, this, of course, is not just Boston College. This is across the country. Everybody and all universities are talking about this. Let me just read to give an example. This is from the Chronicle of Higher Education. One of the editors of the Chronicle of Higher Education did this study of by calling heads of mental health centers at various colleges, and she wrote, as a result of this, rates of anxiety and depression among American college students have soared in the last decade, and many more students than in the past come to campus already on medication for such illnesses. Some are dealing with serious issues such as psychoses, but many others are struggling with what campus counselors say are the usual stresses of college life: bad grades, breakups, being on their own for the first time, and so on. So the point is that by virtue of our being so concerned with protecting our children, we are not preparing children for independent life as adults. And this has become something of my mission, to see how we can regain an understanding that children need freedom in order to grow. And as children grow older, from age 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 and into their teenage years, they need ever more freedom gradually, as opposed to being completely cocooned and then suddenly turned out at some point. So that's the other thing I want to say is, I won't belabor this, but there's actually, believe it or not, a standardized test for creative thinking, and called Torrance's Tests of Creative Thinking. And this has been around for quite a number of decades. And it turns out to be a valid test. And the way we know it's valid is because those people who score high on this test when they're school children are far more likely to contribute to the culture in some creative way in adulthood than those who scored lower. They're more likely to invent new products, found new companies, write novels, the whole range of things that we consider to be creative contributions to the culture. This is a far better predictor than IQ, way better predictor than grades in school, which turns out not really to be a predictor at all, and better predictor than teachers' estimates, their guesses as to who's going to be creative and adult. It's the best predictor we have. It's sad, therefore, to realize that at least ever since 1984, by the way, 1984 is the kind of the inflection point where schools began to move along the No Child Left Behind. All this standardized testing began to occur. Recess began taken away and reduced. Children's freedom to spend time outdoors on their own during the lunch period and so on began taken away. Uh, Classes became less creative. There was less art and at least less kind of creative art and much more focus on stuff that you could measure on a multiple choice test. So, but beginning then, on through the time that the data was done in the early 21st century, when the study ended, tests, the average score all grade levels was going down, continuously down from 1984 until about 2010, which was when the study was published. Down dramatically, such that the average creativity score of a kid in 2010 was at what would have been the 15th percentile level in 1984. Dramatic decline in creativity at a time in history when we need creative people more than we ever have before. The non-creative jobs have been taken over by robots and computers, and we don't need people who can do routine things. We don't need people who can memorize lots of information. Oh, you've got that right on your iPhone. We don't need people who can do routine calculations. We've got computers that do that for us. You don't even have to put in the data, you just run it through. What we need is people who can ask questions that other people didn't think of. We need people who can find answers to such questions. We need people who have good social skills. You know, we need people who can who have moral values. We need people. These are things that computers and robots can't do. And this is what we need. And we are not training people for that in our schools. We're training those things out of people in our schools. The way these things the way children develop these things is in their out of school activities. They develop them in their free time. They develop them in their own pursuits, which are necessarily creative. Play is always creative. When children are creating their own activities, they're being creative. When children are working on how to make friends and how do I make friends with so-and-so, they're being creative. They are always being creative when they're on their own. They are not being creative when they're being told by some adult what to do and what not to do. So that's the crux of what I wanted to say. I wanted to just make a couple of other comments before I turn it over to some questions and discussion. Chris had asked me to say something about the ages of about 9 to 11. And I had fun thinking about the age of, I guess because some of the concern here is with a school that is for fourth grade through, fourth and fifth grade. So this would be about age 9 to 11. These are I think most of us, if we think back, especially if we're above a certain age, if you think back, those are sort of the glory years of childhood, aren't they? I mean, you're at the top of the pile of being a kid. You haven't yet become an adolescent, where in some sense you kind of have to start over again and figure out how to be an adolescent. But you've had a number of years of experience at being a kid. And you are pretty confident at the game of being a kid and you're spreading your wings, and there's something very healthy about that attitude of kind of confidence. And I want to do these things. And, I think if you're at that age, especially if you're allowed to spread your wings, you're allowed to get around, you're allowed to take some initiative, you're allowed to develop even more courage than you could develop before. That prepares you for the years of adolescence. You kind of have mastered childhood. I'm ready to go on into adolescence and deal with the anxieties of that because I've developed the confidence I can deal with things, and so I think those really are kind of critical years. Those are when I think about my glory years of childhood, and the independent fishing trips I took, we took I was living in northern Minnesota at the time, and my friends and I, we would take all day skating trips on this 5 mile long lake when we were 9, 10, 11 years old. We'd light fires on the islands along the way and heat up our hot dogs or whatever we took with us. We had such adventures. We would, in the summer, there was an old rowboat, and we would go out fishing and row to very parts. There was never any concern that we couldn't handle this, so this is what I think of when I think of 9, 10, 11 years old. Those were really wonderful, wonderful years, and they ought to be wonderful years for everybody. They ought to be wonderful years of real exploration. Just to kind of in closing, I might just mention an organization that I've been involved with. Is called Let Grow. Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the wonderful book Free Range Kids, is the president of it, and she and I founded the organization together a few years ago. And we're working with schools to bring more independent activity into schools, more free play, more age mixed play in schools, and also more adventures that are part of, in some sense, the school curriculum, where children are given the opportunity for adventures outside of school as part of what they're doing for school. So parents have to take it seriously, because school is saying your kid needs this adventure. So so at any rate, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I should stop now.
I think it's definitely pretty big for kids to be able to walk uptown. It gives them a feeling of maturity and, like independence. So when you're going into middle school, you can ease into that a little more. And then I think the Dale Street location is really nice because Memorial is right there. And I remember being at Memorial and looking up to all those kids at Dale Street, and they just seemed so big. That was really awesome. And then it's just a really good location. It's got some history to it, and I think you can really feel that. So I think just redoing it and making it a little nicer would be great for Dale Street.
I think that Dale Street is a really fun place. You can do a lot, you can walk uptown, you can play basketball across the street. You can also you get to experience something new instead of staying at the same place. That's pretty exciting, and when you walk uptown, there's a lot of places you can go, stuff like that.
I would say that for me, it's the experience of getting to a new school, getting to know different kids, and being able to interact with the older grade. And there's so many different fun experiences you can do. It's right uptown. You don't have to walk far. And it's just a really fun experience. It would be weird to be with younger kids if Dale Street was being built next to Wheelock, because you'd be with younger kids. And if you got to go to a new school, you'd feel that you're with older kids, you feel more mature, and it's an easier transition to the middle school because you feel older since you're not stuck with the young kids.
Yeah, as a mom, I think, and as an educator, and watching my 2 children go through the Dale Street School, transitioning from Memorial to Wheelock and then to Dale, I think that there has been much talk about transitions being sometimes more difficult. But I would argue that some transitions I think are really good. I've seen that my girls have both adapted really well by the support of the teachers and the administration at each individual school, that they have gained a lot of resilience, surrounded by the unknowing of a lot of new things about each school, how to get around, how to navigate classrooms, and that there are many new skills that these kids will bring from each of the experiences they've had, so that by the time they're at the middle school, I think that they have an easier time transitioning because of the resilience that they've gained from the experiences of transitioning to new schools.
Anybody else have any questions, comments? I know that there was another, one of the moms in here, Catherine Thorpe, said, not a question, but a comment. Wow, thank you, Mr. Gray. I 100% agree. As an educator in kindergarten and now at the high school, I see so clearly the importance of free play. 6 years ago, while an aide in a kindergarten class, the teacher I worked with was the only teacher who had a quote play kitchen and a section of class for free play. Free play is where kids learn to be a friend, learn to advocate for themselves, and learn how to live in this world.
Nicely stated.
So there you go. So we thank you so much for coming tonight. This was great.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to have to go downtown sometime when those kids are out there.
Yeah.
I do a lot of bicycling around, and it's very interesting. Once the pandemic came and kids were home from school and there were a lot of other things they couldn't do, I suddenly, even in Millis and places where I've never seen kids out riding bicycles before, I began seeing kids riding bicycles. So in some sense, there was a beneficial effect there. They had free time.
Right.
Parents said, well, this is at least something they can do. I saw a lot of parents teaching their kids how to ride bicycles, including kids who were beyond the age that one would normally think they should already know how to ride a bicycle, but they're so I'm gonna be tempted to go down, gear my bicycling down towards your part of towards Medfield. I'm very close by.
Yeah.
Just because it's so rare these days to see kids in public spaces
Right.
who aren't being controlled, directed by adults.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll let you know when the next half day is. That's when it really gets interesting.
Do that.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
So,
Well, bye-bye, everybody.
all right. Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you.
Sort of meet
This
you.
was an honor for me personally, because this has been a dream to have you host you to speak. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. Bye.